Hello everyone, I'm Asher and welcome back to the Filmcast. Today I'll be reading a story I wrote called Slender Man. This is not only my first horror story, but it is also my first story in a little universe you probably know about by this point called the Cryptic Monster Universe, which I will talk about more at the end of this video. Now before I begin, I would like to say why I wrote this story in the first place. The first reason is that Slender Man actually had a big part in my childhood, as the Slender Man video game was the first horror game I ever played. And I never won that game because Slendy would always get me before I collected all the 8 pages. The second reason is because there was a movie made about him released in 2018, and that movie was terrible, and pretty much destroyed Slender Man's reputation, and I felt he deserved better, so I wrote the story about him to give some honor back into his name. This intro is getting a little long, so let's not waste any more time, and let's dive into Slender Man. The story starts with a teenage girl running into a cabin in the woods with visible terror on her face. She runs through the cabin and locks herself into a bedroom and stares at the door with fear as if something is chasing her. Suddenly, an unseen force starts pounding at the door, sending the girl into a flight of panic. She ultimately reaches into a drawer and pulls out a revolver and then points it at the door. The door is about to break, but soon she lowers the gun from the door as whatever is behind it is about to break in. The girl sheds a single tear, closes her eyes, and then turns the gun on herself. When the door is broken down, a gunshot is heard, and the screen cuts to black. The scene then cuts to a funeral being held for the girl, whose name is revealed to be Charlotte. Many are present at the funeral, including Charlotte's disheartened parents, but the scene shows 3 other teenagers also present at the funeral. The teenagers are Claire, Michelle, and Paul, all of whom were good friends of Charlotte. The group mourn the loss of their friend as the coffin slowly descends into the ground. After the funeral, Claire, Michelle, and Paul travel to Charlotte's house after their parents tell them that Charlotte left some stuff behind for them, and the parents ask them to come and pick them up. Upon arrival, the 3 start reminiscing about good memories they have of Charlotte in the past and talk about how kind and funny she was in an attempt to quell the sadness of her loss. As the trio collect the items given to them, Claire finds a letter inside of a box that was given to her according to a separate letter left by Charlotte. Claire decides to hold off on reading the letter and decides to just gather her given items and just to read it when she returns home. After a few hours, the teens say goodbye to each other and head off home. Claire gets home and sits on her bed with the items she was given and pulls out the letter to read it. The letter was written by Charlotte before her death and was written to Claire directly. The letter states that if Claire truly wants to know why Charlotte took her life, she should read a sentence included in the letter, and upon doing so, Claire is confused because the sentence doesn't make any sense, but seemingly alludes to something with the name Slender. Claire puts the letter in her closet, and after getting back on the bed, starts crying over the loss of Charlotte. After a while, Claire manages to calm down and eventually falls asleep. That night, Claire has a dream where she encounters Charlotte in a forest and hugs her in happiness, but this event is cut short when Charlotte says something to Claire. Charlotte tells Claire to beware, and when Claire asks for what, Charlotte mutters, "Slender Man." Suddenly, a row of black tentacles emerge from thin air, grab Charlotte and pull her away. Claire gives chase, but Charlotte is pulled out of sight much to her dismay. Claire stops running, however, when she hears a scream in the distance and realizes the scream is saying, "Run." Then the black tentacles emerge from the forest and wrap around Claire, after which she is pulled into the darkness of the forest. Claire suddenly jolts awake in her bed with sweat streaming down her face and at first starts panicking, but eventually calms down after realizing it was only a nightmare. The next day, Claire meets up with Michelle and Paul after school, and the two start walking to the parking lots to get to their cars. As they walk, the trio starts talking about plans to do during the summer, since the school year has just ended, and they sprout out ideas. Claire is walking behind them, but stops when she notices something in her peripheral vision and turns to look at a tree line in the distance. Claire looks to see a figure standing halfway behind a tree and looking at her without moving an inch. The being Claire is looking at is 8 feet tall, has long arms and legs, and wears a black tuxedo, and has completely white skin, and its face has absolutely no features. Unknown to Claire, this creature is Slender Man, the being she was warned about by Charlotte in the nightmare. Claire is confused and unnerved at the sight of Slender Man and points it out to Michelle and Paul when they notice her staring at the forest. Claire points to Slender Man to show Michelle and Paul what she's looking at, but the two get confused when they see nothing there. Claire looks at them and swears she sees something there, but when she looks back, she notices that the creature is gone. The 3 are left confused for different reasons, but eventually decide to just brush it off and go to their cars. Claire is the last to leave the parking lot, but as she drives off, behind her, standing in the schoolyard, is Slender Man staring at her, and she doesn't even see him. A few days later, Claire, Michelle, and Paul meet up, and they decide to walk to a nearby arcade to play games and pass the time. One quick side note, this story takes place in a small American town in the 1980s, so that's why they're walking to an arcade. Anyway, back to the story. As they walk across town, Claire looks to see Slender Man standing in the middle of a park and looking right at her, but she decides to not say anything this time to not spoil her time with her friends and just ignores it. The three walk into the arcade and start having fun playing games. As Michelle watches Paul play one of the games, Claire walks into the restroom, but upon entering, feels something is wrong. She looks around, but sees nothing out of the ordinary, even though that feeling is still strong. Claire eventually backs up, and as the feeling grows stronger and stronger, the situation takes a sinister turn. Claire hears a sound from a window behind her, and when she turns around, Slender Man is standing right outside the window and looking right at her. Claire jumps back in fright and is so scared that she gets nauseous and even almost throws up on the ground. She looks back up at the window and sees Slender Man gone, as if he wasn't even there. Michelle then walks in to find Claire sick and immediately rushes over to check on her. Michelle decides to take Claire home, and after gathering Paul, the two get her home and sit her down on a couch. Michelle and Paul are about to leave until Claire tells them to stay and once again tells them about Slender Man and the encounters she's experienced. Claire even tells them about the nightmare she had a while back and admits that she is afraid and asks her friends for help. Just like last time, Michelle and Paul are skeptical about Claire's story, but assure her that they will try their best to help her in any way they can. Paul tells Claire that she should probably visit a doctor, suggesting that perhaps she's just been seeing a hallucination. After some discussion, Claire agrees to visit a doctor and soon travels to a hospital with her parents. The doctor gives Claire some medicine after doing some tests and hearing her stories about what she's been seeing. The next day, Claire takes the medicine and doesn't see Slenderman stalking her anywhere, and rejoices now that she no longer has to be paranoid. Claire then spends the next few weeks with her friends and enjoys her time now that Slenderman is gone. One day, however, Claire is resting at home until her home phone rings, and when she picks it up, is greeted by Charlotte's mother, who asks her to come over, saying she has something to show her. Claire drives to Charlotte's house and meets her mom, after which Claire is given a notebook that Charlotte wrote in before her death. Charlotte's mom explains that she read the contents of the notebook but didn't understand them, and she asks Claire to read them to see if she can understand what it says. Claire thanks Charlotte's mom for the notebook, and after saying goodbye to her, drives off home to read the notebook. Once Claire gets home, she walks into her room and starts looking over the pages of the notebook. The first pages are accounts of events that Charlotte seemed to be experiencing and talk about weird events happening. The notebook describes strange happenings, but mainly talk about something referred to as he, much to Claire's confusion. Claire continues reading the notebook and keeps seeing mentions of this he, and as she reads, the notebook starts saying some weird stuff. The information in the notebook includes sentences like, "He keeps following me. I see him standing outside my window. He's getting closer. I fear that he will reach me eventually, and I can't imagine what he'll do." Claire gets angry over the lack of an explanation, and then blurts out, "Who is he, Claire? Who are you talking about?" Claire turns the page and drops the notebook in shock when she gets her answer. What Claire sees on the page is a drawing of a black forest, and standing in the middle of the forest is Slender Man. Claire is shocked by this, as she could have sworn Slender Man wasn't real, but now it seems that her closest friend was already aware of this being. Claire observes the picture and sees what looks like black tentacles emerging from Slender Man's back, which she connects to the tentacles she saw in the nightmare a while back. Claire also thinks about the letter that alluded to Slenderman and realizes what she read actually summoned him to her. Claire starts getting uneasy as she realizes that Slenderman may actually be real, but then questions why he disappeared for a while until she hears a strange sound in her room. What Claire didn't know was Slenderman never actually disappeared. He just hid out of sight of her to trick her and continued stalking her. Out of nowhere, black tentacles emerge from under Claire's bed and attempt to grab her and pull her under. Claire manages to get loose and immediately runs out of her room to tell her parents of what just happened. Claire tells her parents what happened, but first they think she had a hallucination, but then she tells them that it couldn't have been since she took her medicine. Claire's parents take her back up to her room and look around to see if they can find anything unusual, but find nothing out of the ordinary. Claire then attempts to show her parents the notebook, but is horrified when she can't find it anywhere. Claire insists that she has proof that what she's been seeing is real, but her parents just tell her to lay down and get some rest. Later that night, Claire wakes up from a sound outside her house and gets up to look out her window. Claire looks around and eventually spots Slender Man standing in the distance next to a bonfire and still looking at her. One of Slender Man's tentacles emerges from his back, and when Claire looks close, realizes that the tentacle is holding the notebook. Slender Man drops the notebook into the fire, much to Claire's horror, since her only evidence to prove Slender Man's existence has just been destroyed. Claire tries to stay up all night and watch Slender Man to make sure he doesn't get close to her, but eventually she gets exhausted and falls asleep. She wakes up the next morning to find Slender Man gone, though she isn't surprised this time. Claire gets ready to leave her house to meet up with her friends, but before she leaves, her parents tell her to be safe and to call them if something bad happens. Claire thanks them, leaves the house, and then gets in her car to meet up with Michelle and Paul. As Claire drives off, watching her from a distance is Slender Man, who first stares at her, but then suddenly turns his head towards her house. Claire meets up with her friends, and the trio walk together through a park to spend the day. After walking for a while, they take a break at a lake and begin chatting. As Michelle and Paul discuss between each other, Claire continues looking around for Slender Man, but doesn't see him stalking her anywhere. Claire is first relieved that Slender Man is gone, but then gets concerned by his absence as she begins to wonder where he actually is, but decides to put it aside to spend time with her friends. As the sun begins to set, the teens go back to the parking lot, but as they reach their cars, Michelle and Paul tell Claire that they were already aware of her being paranoid. They then tell her that if she needs any help from either of them, to just come over and see them. Claire thanks them for their kindness, and the three drive home. Claire arrives home and calls out to her parents to tell them that she's back, but gets no response. Claire searches around her house for her parents and knows they didn't just leave since their car was in the driveway, but during her search, discovers an odd smell in the house. Claire tries to find the source of the smell, and after following the scent, discovers the bodies of her parents. Claire rushes to see if they're alive, but they're dead, and sees that they seemingly died from knife wounds after finding a bloody knife on the ground. Claire, however, realizes something is off when she checks their wounds and finds them with circular-shaped holes instead of knife-shaped ones. Claire finds out that the holes resemble that of Slender Man's tentacles and finds out he is responsible. Claire is about to call the police, but realizes something about the murders. Claire realizes that Slender Man has actually set her up to make it look like she committed the murders, meaning if the police find the bodies, they will immediately get suspicious of her. Claire then rushes out to her garage, gets in her car, and drives off with Slender Man watching her from a distance. As night begins to fall, Claire drives to Michelle's house to get comfort from her friend. Claire arrives, and Michelle greets her and lets her in. The two sit down, and Claire explains what she just found, and then tells Michelle why she came to her house. Michelle is shocked by what Claire tells her, and when Claire starts crying, Michelle hugs her to calm her down. Suddenly, Michelle backs up and starts making odd sounds. When Claire looks up, sees Slender Man standing behind Michelle, choking her with his black tentacles. Claire gets up and tries to pull the tentacles off of Michelle's neck to save her friend, but Slender Man's strength is too great for Claire to stop. Michelle stops moving and drops to the ground after the tentacles loosen their grip around her. Claire rushes over to see if she's alive, but finds that she's dead. After which she gets up and starts yelling at Slender Man at what he wants, but the only thing Slender Man does is look up behind Claire. Claire turns around to see Michelle's parents, who walked in to see Claire standing in front of Michelle's dead body. Claire then realizes that she was set up again. Michelle's parents think that Claire just murdered Michelle because they too can't see Slender Man. Claire desperately tries to explain that she didn't do it, but they don't listen, and Michelle's father charges at Claire to tackle her, while Michelle's mom gets a phone to call the police. After a struggle, Claire manages to get out of the house and get in her car with Michelle's father chasing her down. Claire then drives off before Michelle's dad can catch her, and Slender Man stands behind him, watching Claire leave in a hurry. Claire drives in a panic, and after driving a long distance, stops to think for where else she can go. Claire then realizes she can travel to Paul's house and see if she can get help from him. Claire starts driving to Paul's house and makes her way through a forest to reach his house, but as she's about to get there, Slender Man suddenly appears in the road. Claire is horrified by this, and this causes her to drive off of the road. Claire gets out of her car and starts running to Paul's house with Slender Man watching her. Claire reaches Paul's house, and upon entering, she jumps into his arms and begs for help. Claire tells Paul he's coming, and when Paul asks who she's talking about, they hear a sound from outside. Paul goes to a safe and pulls out a pistol, and then he gets Claire to hide in a room. Paul thinks there is an intruder outside and is planning on going to investigate and hides Claire to keep her safe. As Paul goes outside, Claire gets paranoid as she keeps hearing sounds from seemingly everywhere. Claire knows Slender Man is here, but can't see him anywhere, and starts fearing for Paul's safety. Suddenly, a knock is heard at the door to the room. Thinking it's Slender Man, Claire screams, "Go away!" But it's revealed to be Paul. Paul enters the room, and the two start discussing stuff like why Claire came and what's been happening. Claire asks Paul where his parents are, and he explains that his parents left to go to dinner, and so he's home alone. As the two talk, they hear a noise coming from the basement, and when Paul gets up to investigate, Claire goes with him because she doesn't want to be alone. The two slowly descend into the basement and realize that a thunderstorm has started outside. Paul tries to turn on the lights, but they don't work, so Claire grabs herself a flashlight, and the two start looking around the basement. The two turn around after hearing a noise coming from a pile of boxes, and Paul slowly approaches them with his gun drawn at the boxes in case a person is hiding in there. Claire shines the light at the boxes, but unbeknownst to her, a lightning strike from outside lights up the basement. And reveals Slender Man standing on the other side of the basement, looking at them. Claire turns around, and after shining the light on the other side of the basement, sees Slender Man standing there and is horrified. Claire grabs Paul, and together they run up the stairs. After getting out of the basement, she locks the basement behind her. Paul is confused as he didn't see anything in the basement, and when he asks what she saw down there, she replies with Slender Man. Paul gets upset by this response because he doesn't believe her, since he, just like everybody else, has never seen Slender Man. Claire tries to convince him that she's telling the truth, but he is still reluctant to believe her. The lights then suddenly go out, much to Paul's anger, and Claire uses the flashlight to find a knife in the kitchen to defend herself. Paul tells Claire that he will go outside to see if he can get the lights on, and tells her to just sit down and wait for him. Claire once again starts getting paranoid as she swears Slender Man is in the room, but wherever she looks, she doesn't see him. Claire then gets up and starts making her way to the door to get back to Paul, but as she gets closer to the door, the lights come back on. And as they come back on, Slender Man appears behind her, and when she sees him, she jumps back and screams. Claire gets back up and using the knife starts stabbing Slender Man aggressively. As Claire stabs Slender Man, Paul appears, and seeing her seemingly stabbing the wall, he gets concerned for the well-being of his friend. Paul raises the gun on Claire, and after seeing him, puts her hands in the air and asks him what he's doing. Paul responds with that he's only trying to help her, and escorts Claire into a room, which he then locks. Paul then grabs a house phone and calls the police because he believes Claire is mentally insane. As Paul waits for the police to arrive, Claire keeps screaming to let her out and keeps telling him that Slender Man is in the house, but he doesn't listen and just waits by the door. The police arrive, and Claire is escorted into a truck while wearing a straitjacket. A small crowd is formed with Paul at its center, and they watch as Claire is being loaded into an ambulance. Paul asks an officer where she will go, and the officer tells him that Claire is being sent to a mental asylum. The officer then explains that they discovered the bodies of Claire's parents and also got the call from Michelle's parents about Michelle's death, much to Paul's surprise. Claire is loaded into the ambulance, and as it drives away, she looks out the window to see Slender Man standing among the crowd looking at her with his head slightly tilted. Claire screams out trying to warn the people, but just like before, they see nothing there. The scene then cuts to a mental asylum and shows Claire in a straitjacket being dragged through a hallway by some staff and eventually being thrown into a room. Claire sits down in the corner of the room, and a doctor walks in to tell her that she will be held in the asylum for a while. The doctor then tells her to get some rest, which she agrees to do, and she closes her eyes. As the door closes, Slender Man appears from behind it and stands up in front of Claire. Claire looks up to see him and starts screaming for help, but no one comes since she is believed to be insane. Slender Man's tentacles emerge once again from his back and start slowly moving towards Claire and manage to grab her since she was in a corner. Claire is lifted and pulled towards Slender Man, and as she gets pulled closer to him, she repeatedly screams, "No!" The screen then slowly zooms in on Slender Man's face, and the screen then starts going static with a creepy sound playing, and then it cuts to black. Though it isn't shown, Slender Man has killed Claire. A few weeks later, a family is shown moving into Claire's house, and while they move stuff in, one of the children opens a closet in what was once Claire's room. The child finds a piece of paper, and when he opens it, reads out the message Claire read out several weeks ago. The child read the message that summons Slender Man to Claire, which means the nightmare that Claire faced at the hands of Slender Man will start all over again, with this child as Slender Man's new target. The screen starts going static, like when Slender Man killed Claire. The sound made in the asylum also sounds, and then the screen cuts to black. And the movie ends. So that was Slender Man, my first attempt at horror, and personally, I like this story. I hope you enjoyed the story as well. Be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more. Join me next time when I read part 2 of the Cryptic Monster Universe, Siren Head. Until then, peace out.